The police captain stared at a water stain on the ceiling while he told me my wife's death was just a tragic accident with no leads. He saw a broken old man in a cheap gray coat, easy to sweep under the rug. He didn't know I was already preparing to plant the charges that would bring their whole world crashing down. But before the walls come tumbling down, take a breath. Pour yourself a drink. Settle in. Let's open the blueprints. My name is Elias Thorne. I am 72 years old, and the calculation for their destruction began the moment I sat under a dying light bulb in a precinct that smelled of lies. The fluorescent light above Captain Miller's desk had a dying ballast. It hummed, a low mosquito whine that burrowed into the space behind my ears. Miller didn't look at me. He was fascinated by a water stain on the drop ceiling tiles, a brownish Rorschach test that looked like a continent on a map of a world where nobody gave a damn. "We've exhausted every avenue, Mr. Thorne," Miller said. His voice was practiced, a smooth layer of spackle over a rotting wall. Traffic cameras were down for maintenance, no witnesses have come forward, the paint chips were inconclusive. I sat perfectly still. My hands were folded in my lap, knuckles pale but relaxed. I've spent 40 years calculating load distributions for bridges and high-rises. I know when a structure is sound, and I know when the foundation is compromised. Miller was compromised. Inconclusive, I repeated. The word tasted like chalk. It was a custom shade, midnight pearl. Manufacturer records show only 3 vehicles in the county registered with that specific factory finish within the last 2 years. Miller finally looked down, but he didn't look at me. He looked at his hands, thick fingers toying with a paperclip, bending the metal until it grew hot and snapped. Miller finally looked down, but he didn't look at me. He looked at his hands, thick fingers toying with a paperclip, bending the metal until it grew hot and snapped. "We checked those owners, Elias. Alibis checked out. Dead ends." He used my first name. That was the tell. It was a clumsily constructed attempt at intimacy, a way to bridge the gap between the man with the badge and the old widower he was trying to sweep out the door. He wanted me to feel like we were on the same side, partners in a tragic, unsolvable mystery. "And the tire tracks?" I asked. My voice was level, calibrated to a low frequency that required him to lean in slightly. "The ABS patterns indicated a heavy SUV, high center of gravity, no attempt to brake until 2 seconds after impact." Miller sighed, a heavy, theatrical exhalation that smelled of stale coffee and peppermint antacids. "Look, Mr. Thorne, I know you're grieving. Eleanor was a pillar of the community. But sometimes bad things happen and the physics just don't leave us enough evidence to build a case. We're putting the file in inactive status. If anything new comes up—" "Inactive?" I said. "Pending new leads." I stood up. My knees popped, a sound like dry twigs snapping, but I didn't wince. I smoothed the front of my wool coat. It was charcoal gray, the same coat I wore to the funeral 3 weeks ago. It still smelled faintly of lilies in the damp earth of the cemetery. "I understand, Captain," I said. Miller blinked, surprised by the lack of resistance. He had braced himself for a shout, for tears, for the chaotic grief of a man who has lost his center of gravity. He wasn't prepared for silence. He wasn't prepared for the way I looked at the file on his desk, not with longing, but with the cold appraisal of a man inspecting a blueprint for fatal errors. "You do?" "Yes," I lied. "I understand perfectly. You have a budget to manage, resources are finite, and the owner of that SUV drives a car that pays your pension," I thought. I walked out of the office. The precinct hummed with the banality of bureaucracy, phones ringing, radios squawking static, the heavy clack of keyboards. Nobody looked up. I was just another gray-haired man in a gray coat, a piece of background scenery, easily ignored, a ghost before I was even dead. I pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped out into the winter afternoon. The air hit me like a slap, cold, sharp, smelling of ozone and diesel exhaust. The sky was the color of a dirty nickel. It was going to snow again. I didn't go home. The house was too quiet. The silence there wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, pressurized, like the air in a submarine diving past its crush depth. Instead, I got into my truck, a 10-year-old Ford that ran like a watch because I maintained it that way, and drove to the intersection of 4th and Oak. This was where the world ended. I parked a block away and walked the rest. I needed to feel the ground under my boots. I needed to verify the friction. The intersection was busy. Cars rushed past, ignorant of the history stained into the asphalt. I stood on the corner, near the light post where Eleanor had been waiting for the signal. The walk sign flickered, a white silhouette of a man moving forward. She had stepped off the curb. She had the right of way. The law was on her side. The laws of physics, however, did not care about municipal codes. I looked at the road. The police had cleaned the scene, or the rain had. There was no glass left, no plastic shards from a shattered headlight, just a faint gray smear on the dark asphalt where the fluids had leaked out, resistant to the scrubbers. I closed my eyes and the schematic formed in my mind. I didn't see the blood. I saw the vectors. Object A, pedestrian, mass approximate 60 kilograms, velocity 1.5 meters per second. Object B, vehicle, mass approximate 2,500 kilograms, velocity approximate 20 meters per second. I opened my eyes. I looked at the skid marks that weren't there. The driver had been distracted, there would be a swerve. If the driver had been drunk, the approach vector would be erratic. But the path was straight. They hadn't seen her? No. The sightlines here were clear for 200 yards. They saw her. They just didn't think she mattered enough to slow down. A city bus roared past, kicking up a cloud of grit and dirty slush. I didn't flinch. I watched the traffic lights cycle through its program. Green, yellow, red, green. A mindless mechanical loop. Miller lied about the traffic camera. I looked up at the lens mounted on the traffic arm. It was a dome unit, hardened against vandalism. Maintenance. I had designed the mounting brackets for the city's camera upgrade project 5 years ago. I knew the specs. Those units had a 99.9% uptime requirement. They didn't go down from maintenance without a work order filed in triplicates, and they certainly didn't go down during the exact 3-minute window when my wife was killed. Someone had reached into the digital architecture and excised the footage. That required access. That required authority. The wind bit at my exposed face, numbing my cheeks. I felt a tightening in my chest, a pressure building behind my sternum. It wasn't a heart attack. It was rage. But it wasn't the hot, blinding rage of a younger man. This was cold. This was the temperature of deep-sea water. It was clarifying. I looked across the street. There was a campaign poster stapled to a telephone pole. It was peeling at the corners, flapping in the wind. Mayor Robert Calloway. His face was airbrushed into a trustworthy tan, his smile gleaming, his eyes fixed on a horizon that didn't exist. A safer tomorrow, the slogan read. I remembered the gossip at the hardware store. Calloway's son, Julian. A boy who had never been told no in his life. A boy who drove a Midnight Pearl SUV. I looked back at the gray smear on the road. They think it's over, Elle, I whispered. My voice was lost under the rumble of a passing delivery truck. The police had closed the file. They had erected a wall of bureaucracy and silence, counting on my grief to act as the mortar that held it together. They expected me to go home, sit in my armchair, look at old photo albums, and slowly fade away into the role of the tragic widower. They expected me to be a victim, but I am not a victim. I am an engineer. When a structure is condemned, you don't just walk away from it. You inspect it. You find the stress points. You drill holes in the load-bearing columns. You pack the charges. You bring it down, controlled and precise, so that it doesn't hurt the surrounding buildings. I turned my collar up against the wind. The cold felt good now. It felt like focus. I walked back to my truck, my steps measured and even on the cracked sidewalk. I didn't need the police report. I didn't need Captain Miller's false sympathy. The law had finished its job. It had protected the powerful and swept the debris aside. Now, my job was beginning. Invisibility is a skill, but for a man of my age, it is also a condition. You put on a flat cap, a beige cardigan that has seen better decades, and you sit on a park bench with a bag of stale crusts. You become texture. You become civic furniture, as ignorable as a fire hydrant or a cracks in the sidewalk. I sat in Laurel Park,
2 blocks from the Calloway estate for 21 consecutive days. The bench was iron and wood, bolted to a concrete pad that radiated the February chill up through the soles of my boots and into my shins. I didn't mind the cold. It kept me awake. It kept the edges sharp. The Calloway house was a monument to new money trying to look old. It was a sprawling colonial revival with white pillars that were too thick and a brick facade that was too red. It sat behind a wrought iron gate that looked like it belonged on a mausoleum. From my vantage point, obscured by a line of dormant oaks, I had a clear line of sight to the driveway. I wasn't just watching, I was logging data. The subject, Julian Calloway, emerged at 8:45 a.m., Monday through Friday. He was 24, with the soft, undefined jawline of a boy who had been shielded from the consequences of gravity his entire life. He wore cashmere coats that cost more than my first car, and he walked with a hunch, his hands jammed deep into his pockets, eyes scanning the ground. The vehicle was new. That was the first confirmation.
The police report, the real one, the one that existed before the correction, would have noted a dark SUV. Julian was now driving a silver Land Rover fresh off the lot. The dealer plates were still on it. It was pristine, free of dents, free of the biological evidence that would have been scrubbed from the undercarriage of the previous vehicle. It was a sterile replacement for a dirty tool. On the 4th day, a landscaping truck backfired on the adjacent street. The sound was a sharp, percussive crack, like a pistol shot in a library. I watched Julian. He was halfway to the driver's side door. He didn't just startle, he crumbled. He dropped his keys on the pavement. He crouched, his hands flying up to cover his head, his spine curving into a defensive bow. It was a visceral, reptilian reaction. A man who is startled looks around to see what made the noise. A man who is guilty expects the bullet. I tossed a piece of sourdough to a pigeon with a missing foot. "I see you," I whispered. My voice was just a vibration in my throat, lost in the wind. He had the eyes of a dog that knows it has bitten the master. He was waiting for the newspaper to roll up. He was waiting for the discipline. I began to map his life. It was a small, terrified orbit. 0845, departure. 0915, the upscale gym on 5th. He spent 40 minutes there, mostly walking on a treadmill, staring at a TV screen he wasn't watching. 10:30, the coffee shop with the exposed brick walls and the $5 lattes. He sat in the corner, away from the windows. 12 o'clock, lunch, usually takeout, eaten in the car. 13:30, home.
He didn't work. Why would he? His job was to stay out of sight, to let the bruises on the family reputation heal, to let the public memory of the tragic accident fade into the background noise of the news cycle. On the second Sunday, I saw the mayor. Robert Calloway came out to the driveway as Julian was leaving. Robert was a different architectural style entirely, reinforced concrete hidden behind a layer of affable drywall. He moved with the predatory grace of a politician in an election year. I watched through my pocket binoculars. The lenses were small, but the glass was German, Leica from my surveying days. I saw the interaction clearly. Julian reached for the car door. Robert caught his arm. It wasn't a hug, it was a clamp. Robert's fingers dug into the boy's bicep, bunching the expensive wool of his coat. Robert leaned in, speaking low and fast. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the cadence. It was an instruction. Keep your head down. Don't screw this up. I fixed your mess, now you carry the weight. Julian nodded, rapid and jerky. He looked terrified of his own father.
I lowered the binoculars and wiped the lenses with a microfiber cloth. The dynamic was clear. The father was the shield, the son was the crack in the armor. The police had stopped looking because there was nothing to see. The evidence was gone. The car was crushed or hidden. The timeline was alibied. But they hadn't accounted for the human element. They hadn't calculated the sheer, crushing weight of a conscience on a weak mind. Julian was deteriorating. I could see it in the way he drove, too hesitant, stopping a full car length behind the line at intersections. He checked his mirrors constantly. He was haunted. He just didn't know who the ghost was yet. I stood up from the bench, my joints stiff but functional. The pigeons scattered in a flutter of gray wings.
I brushed the crumbs from my trousers. I had enough data. I knew the routine. I knew the weak points. I wasn't going to slash his tires. I wasn't going to throw a brick through his window. That's amateur work. That creates an external enemy, something for them to rally against. I needed to be something worse. I needed to be the manifestation of their own paranoia. I walked to my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots like ground bone. The air smelled of impending snow and wood smoke. I had spent 3 weeks being furniture. Tomorrow, I would become the atmosphere. I would step into the periphery of Julian's vision. I would occupy the spaces he thought were safe. I would turn his guilt into a physical presence. I started the engine. It rumbled to life, steady and reliable. I checked my rearview mirror, looking back at the Calloway house one last time. It looked impenetrable, a fortress of wealth and influence. But every engineer knows the truth. The stiffer the structure, the harder it breaks. You just have to find the right frequency and let it vibrate until it tears itself apart.
Fear is a structural flaw. It starts as a hairline fracture, invisible to the naked eye, buried deep within the concrete. But if you apply steady, rhythmic pressure, not a hammer blow, just a constant vibrating load, the crack widens. Moisture gets in. The freeze-thaw cycle begins. Eventually, the facade shears off, and the whole thing comes down. I began the siege on a Tuesday morning. The coffee shop, the roastery, was an exercise in industrial chic, exposed ductwork, Edison bulbs, and the smell of burnt hazelnut and pretension. It was Julian's sanctuary. I knew from my logs that he arrived at 10:30 a.m. sharp to nurse a latte and scroll through his phone, hiding from the daylight. I arrived at 10:15. I bought a black coffee. It tasted like battery acid, but I didn't drink it for the flavor. I sat at the small round table in the corner, Julian's table, the one with the best view of the door and the most privacy from the street. I unfolded yesterday's newspaper, smoothing the creases with the flat of my hand. When Julian walked in, the bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound for a dead man walking. He was wearing sunglasses, though the sky was overcast. He moved with that same hunched, defensive posture, heading straight for the corner. He stopped 3 feet away when he saw me. I didn't look up immediately. I turned a page, the paper rustling dryly in the quiet shop. I took a sip of coffee. Then I lowered the paper just enough to peer over the reading glasses I didn't really need. I looked him in the eye. I didn't scowl. I didn't grimace. I simply observed him. I looked at him the way a sanitation worker looks at an overflowing bin, an assessment of a mess that needs to be hauled away. Julian froze. His mouth opened slightly, a slack, wet sound. He recognized me. Of course he did. I was the face in the obituary. I was the man standing by the grave he had dug. "Excuse me," he stammered. His voice was thin, reedy. I usually sit there. It's a free country, son," I said. My voice was gravel rolling downhill. At least, that's what the brochure says. I went back to my paper. I read an article about zoning changes. Julian didn't move for 10 seconds. I could hear his breathing, shallow, rapid, the respiration of a rabbit sensing a hawk. He didn't order his coffee. He turned on his heel, his expensive sneakers squeaking on the polished concrete, and walked out. I watched him go through the window. He fumbled with his car keys, dropping them once before scrambling into the driver's seat. Phase 1 complete. I had displaced him. I had taken his safe space and contaminated it with the reality of what he had done. 2 days later, the mayor held a town hall at the community center. The theme was civic pride and public safety. The irony was so thick you could have poured it over pancakes. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and stale sweat. Rows of metal folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a podium draped in red, white, and blue bunting. A banner overhead proclaimed, "Building a future we can trust." I arrived early. I took a seat in the front row, dead center, directly in the firing line of the microphone stand. The room filled up. Concerned citizens, local business owners, the usual sycophants hoping for a zoning variance. When Mayor Calloway walked out, the applause was polite but tepid. He was smiling that polished ceramic smile, waving to people he didn't know. He stepped to the podium, arranged his index cards, and looked out at the audience. "Friends," he began,
his voice booming with practiced baritone warmth. "Neighbors, we gather here today because we care about the streets our children walk on." Then his eyes swept the front row, and he saw me. I was wearing my gray suit. I sat with my spine rigid, hands folded on my lap. I was the only person in the room not smiling, not nodding, not checking a phone. I was a statue of judgment carved from granite. Calloway blinked. It was a micro-expression, a momentary glitch in the software. His smile didn't drop, but the corners of his eyes tightened. We care about the safety of every citizen," he continued, but the rhythm was off. He had missed a beat.
I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a microfiber cloth. Slowly, deliberately, I took off my glasses. I held them up to the light. I began to polish the lenses. Circular motions, round and round. "I am cleaning the glass so I can see you better, Robert." Calloway looked down at his notes. He looked back up. I put the glasses back on and stared at his throat. I visualized the vocal cords vibrating there, the pulse of the carotid artery. "Safety is paramount," he said. He coughed. He reached for the glass of water on the podium. His hand shook. Just a tremor. The water rippled in the glass. He took a sip, but he did it too fast. He choked, just a little, a wet, undignified sound amplified by the microphone system. "K-kull." "Excuse me," he muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The crowd shifted in their seats. They sensed the awkwardness, the sudden drop in charisma, but they didn't know the source. They didn't know the frequency was being jammed. Calloway finished the speech, but he rushed the back half. He skipped the anecdote about the local fire department. He wanted off that stage. He wanted away from the front row. When it was over, he didn't do the usual handshaking line. He exited stage right, flanked by his aides. As he passed through the curtains, he looked back, just once.
I was still sitting there. I nodded to him, a single slow inclination of the head. I'm still here. The psychological rot set in faster than I expected. It was like black mold in a damp basement. Once you smell it, it's already everywhere. I resumed my post at the park bench, but I changed the routine. I started parking my truck on streets where I knew they would pass. I didn't follow them. I just parked it and left it there for an hour. A gray Ford pickup. Innocent. Ubiquitous. But to them, it was a shark fin in the water. Through the binoculars, I saw the changes. Julian stopped going to the gym. The blinds in his room, usually open to let in the morning light, remained drawn until noon. When he did drive, he took erratic routes. He doubled back. He was checking for a tail that wasn't there. Robert was worse. The mayor, the man of the people, stopped using the front entrance of his own home. He started entering through the garage, the door closing rapidly behind his bumper as if he were being chased. On the second Saturday of the siege, I saw them on the veranda. It was cold, but they were outside, arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language was screaming. Robert was pacing, chopping the air with his hand, a gesture of frustration and impotence. Julian was sitting on the patio furniture, head in his hands, rocking slightly. Robert stopped pacing. He grabbed Julian by the shoulders and shook him. Then Robert looked out toward the tree line, toward the park. He couldn't see me. I was deep in the shadows of the oaks, motionless. But he felt me. He knew I was out there, somewhere in the static of the city, watching. They were whispering now, conspiring. The silence of the house had been broken by the noise in their own heads. They weren't sleeping. I could tell by the lights. The upstairs study, Robert's office, stayed lit until 3 a.m., then 4 a.m. The pressure was building. The structure was groaning. I lowered the binoculars and packed them into my satchel. It was time. They were paranoid, jumpy, and irrational. They were looking for an enemy they could fight, an enemy they could sue or arrest. I was about to give them exactly what they wanted, and it would be the shovel they used to dig their own graves. I stood up, the cold stiffness in my knees a familiar companion. Tomorrow, I would let them see the tail. Tomorrow, I would let them think they had caught me. It was a beige Chevy Impala, the kind of car that comes off the assembly line looking like it has already been driven by 3 separate insurance adjusters. It was parked 3 houses down, facing the wrong way against the flow of traffic. I spotted it at 7 a.m. while drinking my coffee by the front window. The driver was heavy-set, wearing a navy blue baseball cap pulled low.
He sat with the engine idling, puffing white clouds of exhaust into the cold morning air. Every few minutes, he would lift a pair of binoculars, take a bite of a donut, and wipe his fingers on his jeans. He was a professional, technically speaking, but he was the discount variety. The kind you hire when you want results fast and you don't care about the noise. I watched him for 20 minutes. He was bored. He was sloppy. He checked his phone, the light from the screen illuminating a face that had seen too many graveyard shifts and too few vegetables. So, they had finally escalated. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction in my gut. It was the feeling of a beam snapping into place. They were digging. They wanted to find a gambling debt, a mistress, a history of alcohol abuse, anything to discredit the old man staring at them in public meetings. They wanted to turn the grieving widower into an unstable threat so they could justify a restraining order, or worse. I put my coffee cup down. It was time to give the man a show. I stepped out onto the porch. I was wearing my bathrobe over my clothes, the belt tied loosely. It was 30 degrees out. I let the cold hit my bare shins. I walked to the mailbox. I knew he was watching. I could feel the lens of his camera telescoping out, the shutter clicking like a mechanical insect. I opened the mailbox. It was empty. I knew it was empty. The mail didn't come until noon. I stared into the metal cavern for a full minute. Then I slammed it shut. "No!" I shouted. I didn't shout it at the mailbox. I shouted it at the oak tree in the front yard. I turned to the tree, waving my arms. "I told you the water was rising. I told you the foundation was sand." I saw the Impala's window roll down an inch. He was listening now. He was recording. I paced the length of the driveway. I muttered to myself, loud enough to carry on the wind but soft enough to require him to strain his ears. I recited the structural specifications of the Golden Gate Bridge, intercut with lines from a nursery rhyme. "Steel cable, tensile strength, hickory-dickory dock. The shear force is too high. The clock struck 1. I stopped abruptly. I grabbed my head in both hands, fingers digging into my scalp, messing up my hair. I mimed a man hearing voices. I mimed a man on the edge of a violent break. Then I froze. I looked directly at the Impala, not at the driver, but at the front tire. I stared at it with intense, confused fascination. Then I ran back inside the house and slammed the door. I went to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. The driver was on his phone immediately. He was excited. He wasn't finding a criminal. He was finding a lunatic. This was better than dirt. This was ammunition. The old man is senile. He's losing it. He's dangerous. Perfect. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk. I needed to reinforce the narrative. I walked to the neighborhood park, the PI trailing me on foot now, 50 yards back. He wore a gray hoodie, trying to look like a jogger, but he was wearing work boots. Amateur. I stopped at a trash can. I dug through it. I pulled out a discarded newspaper, crumpled and stained with coffee. I smoothed it out on a bench and began to read it upside down. I moved my lips as I read, pointing an accusatory finger at the upside-down photos. "Liars," I hissed. "All of them. The angles are wrong." I took a pen from my pocket, a red felt tip, and circled a random advertisement for a car dealership. I drew a jagged X through it. I ripped the page out, folded it carefully into a small square, and tucked it into my shoe. I glanced back. The PI was sitting on a swing set, pretending to tie his boot. He had seen it all. He would report this to Calloway. Subject exhibits signs of paranoid schizophrenia, erratic behavior, fixation on hidden messages. They would feel relieved. A crazy man is easy to dismiss. A crazy man's testimony doesn't hold up in court. A crazy man can be institutionalized if he pushes too hard. But they were missing the point. A crazy man is also unpredictable. A crazy man has no boundaries. A crazy man might do anything. By the time I returned home, the sun was setting. The Impala was back in its spot. I walked up my driveway, stopping to pick up a single dead leaf. I held it up to the sky, inspecting it like a diamond, then put it in my pocket with reverence. I entered the house and locked the door. I stripped off the bathrobe. I combed my hair. I went to the kitchen and made a sandwich with precise, economical movements. I wasn't crazy. I was the sanest man in the city. I was simply building a Trojan horse out of my own reputation. They would pull it inside their walls, thinking it was a harmless, broken thing. They wouldn't know it was hollow until the soldiers poured out. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. I wrote down the license plate of the Impala. I wrote down the time of arrival and departure. 0700, subject arrives, Impala. Plate KYR 592. 1430, subject follows to park. Confirmed surveillance. Status: they are engaged. I ate my sandwich in the dark. The house was silent, but it felt different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was a stage, and the audience had taken their seats. Now I had to write the script for the second act. I had to give them something tangible to fear. I had to prove that my madness had a direction, and that direction was pointing straight at the mayor's legacy. I looked at the blank pages of the leather-bound journal I had bought yesterday. It sat on the counter, smelling of fresh paper and potential violence. Time to write a tragedy, I whispered to the empty room. Outside, the engine of the Impala turned over. The PI was leaving for the night, eager to file his report, eager to tell the mayor that Elias Thorne had lost his mind. He had no idea. I hadn't lost my mind. I was just sharpening it.
The journal cost $20 at a stationery store in the city center. It was bound in faux leather, oxblood red, with thick cream-colored pages that smelled of wood pulp and glue. It was a handsome object, the kind a poet might use to record sonnets. I sat at my drafting table, the angle-poised lamp casting a harsh conical pool of light on the empty page. My hands, usually steady enough to draw a straight line without a ruler, hovered over the paper. I had to unlearn 50 years of muscle memory. My natural handwriting is block capitals, sans serif, precise. It is the script of blueprints and technical specs, legible, rational. To write this journal, I had to break my own hand. I picked up a cheap ballpoint pen, the kind that blots and skips. I gripped it in a fist, like a toddler or a man losing motor control. I pressed the tip into the paper until it dented the fibers. Entry 1, October 14th. I wrote the date of Eleanor's death. I made the letters slant hard to the left. I made them jagged, the loops of the O and the E closed tight, suffocated. They think I don't see the patterns, the red light, the silver bumper, the noise like a wet sack of flour hitting the pavement. I see it every time I close my eyes, but the math doesn't add up. The equation is unbalanced.
I stopped. I looked at the words. They were too neat, too coherent. I tore the page out, crumpling it into a tight ball. I started again. I drank a glass of whiskey, not to get drunk, but to let the tremor into my fingers. I wrote faster this time, letting the pen skid across the page. No breaks. Why no breaks? Because he didn't care. Because to him, she was just drag coefficient. I spent 4 nights filling that book. I created a fictional Elias Thorne, a man who wasn't calculating, but dissolving. I varied the ink. I spilled coffee on page 12. I pressed so hard on page 20 that the paper tore, a ragged wound in the center of a sentence about justice. I built the narrative arc with the same care I used to design load-bearing trusses. Phase 1, grief turning to suspicion. Phase 2, paranoia, the belief that the police were laughing at me. Phase 3, the fixation. I taped a photo of the mayor onto page 30. I drew red circles around his eyes. But that was the distraction. The real target had to be something they couldn't ignore, something that would bypass their legal defenses and strike directly at the reptilian part of their brains.
Leo, the grandson, 6 years old, innocent. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. I'm a man who protects. I have spent my life ensuring roofs don't collapse on families. To write about harming a child, even as a fiction, felt like swallowing broken glass. My stomach knotted, sour and tight, but I forced the pen to move. This wasn't about what I wanted to do. It was about what they needed to believe I was capable of. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, I wrote on page 45. Good. Let them be blind. Let them stumble in the dark like I do. I wrote about the playground at St. Jude's Elementary. I wrote about the blue coat the boy wore. I wrote about how easy it would be to just open the car door, to take something of theirs, to balance the ledger. November 2nd. Watched him on the slide today. He looks like Julian. Same weak chin. Same oblivious laugh. If I take him, Will they understand? Will they finally feel the weight of an empty room? I looked at the words. They were monstrous. They were the ravings of a psychopath.
I sat back, rubbing my eyes. The room was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the wind rattling the loose sash in the window. The journal lay open on the desk, pulsing with malice. It was a forgery, a prop, but it felt heavy, as if the ink contained the actual density of the sins I was fabricating. I picked up the pen one last time. I turned to the final written page. "I have the room ready," I scrawled, the handwriting now almost illegible, a frantic scrawl of peaks and valleys. "Soundproof, safe. I won't hurt him. I just want them to know. I just want them to beg." I dropped the pen. It clattered on the hardwood floor. I closed the book. The oxblood cover looked like a clot. I wasn't going to touch the boy. I would never hurt a child. But Calloway didn't know that. Julian didn't know that. They saw a grieving, erratic old man who muttered to trees and dug through trash. When they read this, they wouldn't see a structural engineer executing a psychological operation. They would see a monster coming for their bloodline. I took the journal to the kitchen. I held it over the stove for a moment, letting the heat warp the cover slightly, giving it the look of something carried in a sweaty pocket, something handled obsessively. It was done. The blueprint for a crime that would never happen, designed to trigger a reaction that definitely would. I placed the journal on the counter next to the recycling bin. Tomorrow was Tuesday. The PI would be doing his sweep. I turned off the lights. The house went dark, but the journal seemed to glow in the gloom, radioactive with intent. I went upstairs to try and sleep, but I knew I wouldn't. I had built the bomb. Now I had to wait for someone to light the fuse.
Tuesday is garbage day. In the suburbs, it is a ritual of purification. We drag our plastic sins to the curb, expecting the city to haul them away and leave us clean. I stood in the kitchen at 5:30 a.m. The house was dark, save for the blue light of the microwave clock. On the table lay the journal. I opened it to page 42. This was the page where the fiction turned from grief to planning. It was the page where I detailed the route Leo took from the school gate to his mother's car. I took a deep breath. The paper was thick, high quality. It resisted the tear. The sound of it ripping was loud in the silence, a sharp, violent zip that felt like tearing a ligament. I ripped out 3 pages. I crumpled them, but not too tight. A man trying to hide evidence burns it. A man trying to hide his own shame in a moment of frustration just throws it away. I needed to look like the latter. I needed to look like a man who had written something terrible in a fugue state, read it back, panicked, and tossed it in the bin, thinking the landfill would keep his secret. I walked out the side door. The morning air was damp, smelling of wet leaves and the distant chemical tang of the industrial district. I lifted the lid of the blue recycling bin. I didn't drop the paper balls on top. That would be too obvious. The PI was sloppy, but he wasn't an idiot. If I served it to him on a silver platter, he'd smell the trap. I dug down past the empty milk cartons and the stack of junk mail. I nestled the crumpled pages inside an empty cereal box, oats and honey, Eleanor's favorite. I pushed the box down, wedging it between a soda bottle and a catalog for winter coats, hidden but accessible to anyone willing to get their hands dirty. I dragged the bin to the curb. The wheels rattled over the asphalt. I left it there, a blue monolith standing sentinel at the end of the driveway. I went back inside, locked the door, and climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom. It faced the street. I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress stiff and unused, and parted the blinds with 2 fingers. Now, the weight. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, a bruised purple turning to gray. At 6:45 a.m., the street was waking up. A neighbor walked a golden retriever. A delivery van idled at the corner. At 7:12 a.m., the beige Impala turned onto the street. He was late today. Maybe he thought I was boring. Maybe he thought he already had enough to justify his paycheck. He parked 3 houses down, just like before. He waited for the neighbor with the dog to turn the corner. Once the street was empty, he moved. He didn't drive up, he walked. He moved with a heavy, rolling gait, hands in the pockets of a hooded sweatshirt. He looked like a man looking for returnable cans. It was a decent cover, if you didn't look at his boots, expensive tactical soles that had never seen a construction site. He reached my driveway. He did a quick scan, left, right, then up at the house. I held my breath,
my fingers still hooking the slat of the blind. To him, the windows were black, reflective voids. He couldn't see the old spider sitting in the web. He lifted the lid of the recycling bin. I saw him grimace. The smell of stale beer and wet cardboard wafted up. He pulled a pair of latex gloves from his pocket, blue nitrile, and snapped them on. He started digging. He moved the catalog. He shook the milk carton. He was thorough. He was looking for receipts, for bank statements, for liquor bottles. He was looking for the debris of a falling man. He pulled out the cereal box. He almost put it back. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Look inside, you vulture. Look inside. He paused. He felt the weight of the box. It wasn't empty. He turned it over and shook it. The 3 balls of crumpled paper tumbled out and landed on top of the junk mail pile. He stared at them. For a second, he looked disappointed. Just paper. He picked one up. He uncrumpled it, smoothing it against the plastic lid of the bin. He leaned in, squinting in the low morning light. I watched his body language transform.
It was instantaneous. One moment he was a bored contractor doing a dirty job. The next he was a pointer dog catching a scent. His spine stiffened. His head snapped down closer to the page. He read the first page. Then he frantically grabbed the other 2, uncrumpling them with less care now. He was hungry. I knew exactly what he was reading. The playground fence is low. He waits by the swing set. Eye for an eye. If they took my heart, I take their future. He didn't put the pages back. He didn't take photos. He folded them hurriedly and shoved them deep into the inside pocket of his jacket. This wasn't trash anymore. This was evidence. This was a felony in progress. He stepped back from the curb, looking at the house again. His gaze was different this time. There was no dismissal in it. There was fear, and there was a predator's excitement. He had found the blood trail. He turned and walked back to his car, but he wasn't strolling anymore. He was marching. He got into the Impala and didn't even start the engine before his phone was at his ear.
I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see the silhouette of his head bobbing, the emphatic gestures of his free hand. He was telling Calloway. He was telling him that the crazy old man wasn't just shouting at trees, he was planning an abduction. I let the blinds snap back into place. I walked to the master bedroom and sat in the chair by the window. My hands were steady. My pulse was slow. The trap was primed. The bait was taken. They believed the lie because it confirmed their worst fears about me and about themselves. They believed that grief turns men into monsters because that is what they would become in my place. I heard the Impala start up and peel away, tires chirping on the cold asphalt. He was rushing to deliver the payload. I went downstairs to make a pot of coffee. I had a lot to do before tonight. The house needed to be prepared. The stage needed to be set for the final act. The hook was set deep in the jaw. Now, I just had to reel them in. Reaction time is a variable I usually account for, but when the variable is wearing a badge and a Kevlar vest, the physics change. It was 4 p.m. The sky was already darkening, the sun retreating behind a bank of slate-gray clouds that promised ice before morning. I was walking back from the pharmacy, a white paper bag in my hand containing blood pressure medication that I don't really need, but keep filling to maintain the appearance of a man holding on by a thread. The cruiser didn't use its siren. It didn't flash its lights. It simply surged up onto the sidewalk, cutting off my path with the aggressive geometry of a predatory animal. The tires hopped the curb, crunching through the frozen slush, the heavy grille stopping 2 feet from my knees. I stopped. I didn't run. I clutched the pharmacy bag to my chest like a shield. 2 doors opened simultaneously. The officers emerged. I recognized the uniforms, city police, but not the men. They weren't the local beat cops who nodded at me when I swept my porch. These were larger, wider men. They moved with the heavy, flat-footed confidence of people who are used to occupying space that doesn't belong to them. Mr. Thorne, the driver said. He was tall, with a neck that spilled over his collar. His name tag read Vance, badge number 4092. Officer? I made my voice quaver. It wasn't hard. The adrenaline had dumped into my system, cold and sharp, but I channeled it into a tremor rather than a combat stance. "We need to have a word about neighborhood safety," Vance said.
He didn't invite me into the car. He stepped into my personal radius, forcing me back.
I took a step, my heel catching on a patch of ice. I stumbled. The second officer, a shorter man with eyes like ball bearings, caught my arm. It wasn't a helping hand. He gripped my bicep and swung me around, slamming my back against the brick wall of the bakery we were standing in front of. The air left my lungs in a sharp whoosh. The brick was rough against my wool coat, biting into my shoulder blades. "Careful there, Pop," the second one said. His breath smelled of stale tobacco and wintergreen gum. "Badge number 5110. Name tag, Rivers." "I don't know what you mean," I wheezed. I let my shoulders slump. I let my eyes dart between them, wide and wet. Vance stepped in close. He placed a hand on the wall next to my head, leaning in until his face was inches from mine. It was a classic intimidation posture, designed to trigger claustrophobia, to make the victim feel small. "We heard you've been having a hard time, Elias," Vance said. His voice was low, a mock sympathetic purr. "Confused, leaving trash where it doesn't belong, writing stories." He knew about the journal. The PI had delivered the goods. Calloway had seen the threat, and he had sent his dogs to bark. "I don't know what you mean," I stammered. Rivers drove his knuckles into my side. It was a precise strike, right between the 6th and 7th ribs. Pain flared, hot, bright, and immediate. It wasn't a break, I calculated instantly. The pressure was diffuse enough to avoid a fracture, but concentrated enough to bruise the intercostal muscles. It would hurt to breathe for a week. I cried out, a sharp, pathetic yelp. I doubled over, clutching my side. "We think you need a break," Vance continued, ignoring my reaction. He used his other hand to pat my cheek. It was condescending, a violation of dignity that burned hotter than the bruise on my ribs. "The mayor thinks you look stressed. Maybe a vacation is in order, somewhere far away. Florida is nice this time of year. Or maybe a facility, somewhere they can watch you round the clock." "Please," I whispered. I'm just an old man." "Exactly," Rivers said. He leaned his weight against me, pinning me to the bricks. "And old men get hurt when they wander into traffic. Old men get confused. We'd hate to see you get hurt, Elias. Accidents happen all the time." They were enjoying this. That was their mistake. They were viewing this transaction through the lens of power. They had the guns, the badges, the youth, and the strength. They saw a frail senior citizen cowering in a wool coat. They didn't see the engineer recording the stress data. I memorized the scar on Vance's chin, a jagged white line, likely from a ring or a bottle. I memorized the way Rivers favored his left leg, shifting his weight. I memorized the specific sour milk smell of the cruiser idling 3 feet away. "I understand," I choked out. I'll stop. I promise." "See?" Vance smiled. It was a shark smile, all teeth and no warmth. He pushed off the wall. He straightened my collar, a gesture of ownership. "Pack a bag, Elias," Vance said. "Be gone by the weekend, for your health." They turned and walked back to the cruiser. They didn't look back. They didn't have to. In their minds, the structure had been condemned. They had applied the pressure, and I had buckled. I stayed against the wall as they drove away. The cruiser's taillights were 2 angry red eyes disappearing into the traffic. I waited until they were gone. Then I straightened up. I put a hand to my ribs. I pressed specifically on the tender spot. I winced. The pain was real. It was a dull, throbbing ache that synchronized with my heartbeat. Good. Pain is a teacher. Pain is a reminder of the stakes. I picked up the pharmacy bag from the slush where I had dropped it. The paper was wet, dissolving, but the bottle inside was intact. I looked around. A woman across the street was looking at me, horror on her face. She had seen the police accost an elderly man. She had seen the shove. She looked like she wanted to come over, to ask if I was all right. I turned away from her. I didn't want pity. I wanted to get to work. I started walking home. My stride was slower now, favoring my right side. I didn't have to act that part, but my mind was running at high efficiency. They had made contact. That meant they were scared. If they thought I was just a senile nuisance, they would have sent a social worker. If they thought I was a harmless crank, they would have ignored me. Sending 2 uniformed thugs to break my ribs meant they believed the journal. They believed I was capable of taking the boy. They were trying to scare me out of town because they were terrified of what I might do if I stayed. They thought they had delivered a warning. What they had actually delivered was a confirmation code.
I reached my house. It looked dark and cold against the winter sky. I unlocked the door and stepped into the foyer. The silence welcomed me. I took off my coat, hissing through my teeth as the movement pulled at my bruised side. I hung the coat on the rack. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I took a painkiller, not the blood pressure meds, but an ibuprofen. I sat at the table. I looked at the empty space where the journal used to be. Badge 4092. Badge 5110, I said aloud, testing the memory. I would add them to the file. When the house of cards came down, they would fall with it. They had put their hands on me. They had physically enforced the corruption. That made them complicit in a way that couldn't be explained away as following orders. I stood up. The pain in my ribs was a fuel source now. It burned clean. Time to pack, I said.
But I wasn't packing for a vacation. I wasn't going to Florida. I was clearing the blast zone. I walked to the living room and looked at the china cabinet. Eleanor's collection. Porcelain figurines, delicate and useless. They had to go. The photos on the mantel. The quilt on the back of the sofa. The house had to be hollowed out. It had to be stripped of everything that made it a home, until it was nothing but a shell, a glass house waiting for the stone to be thrown. I moved to the first box. I started wrapping the porcelain in newspaper. My hands were gentle, despite the violence they had just witnessed. I wrapped them like I was wrapping explosives. I was weak. I was desperate. I was dangerous. 2 out of 3 isn't bad.
The sound of packing tape ripping off the roll is a violent noise. It sounds like a bandage being torn off a wound that hasn't healed. I stood in the dining room, surrounded by cardboard boxes. My ribs throbbed a dull, heavy bass line against the melody of my movements, a reminder of Officer Rivers and his brick wall. I worked through the pain. Pain is just a signal. It doesn't require a permit to operate. I started with the china. It was Royal Doulton, the pattern Eleanor had picked out 45 years ago. Blue willow, delicate, useless. We had used it maybe 10 times. It was a symbol of a life we thought we were supposed to live. Dinner parties, holidays, stability. I wrapped each plate in a sheet of yesterday's newspaper, the same newspaper that carried the mayor's approval rating polls. I placed them in the box, edge to edge, filling the voids with crumpled paper so they wouldn't shift. I wasn't just packing dishes. I was packing the acoustics of the house. Without the china rattling in the hutch, without the books absorbing the sound, the room would echo. It would sound like a tunnel. The hardest part was the bedroom. I opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. The smell hit me instantly. Lavender, mothballs, and the faint, dusty sweetness of dried rose petals. It was the smell of her. For a moment my hand shook. I gripped the edge of the chest until my knuckles turned white, waiting for the wave of grief to crash over me. It didn't crash. It just sat there, a high watermark in my chest, cold and stagnant. I lifted the quilt. She had made it during the winter of '98, a patchwork of flannel and cotton. It was heavy. I folded it into squares, compressing the air out of the batting. I placed it in a plastic bin and snapped the lid shut. I am evicting her ghost to save her memory. If I leave these things here, they become collateral damage. When the storm hits, and it will hit, I cannot have the goons smashing her teapot or trampling her quilt. I needed the house to be a husk. I spent the next 6 hours shuttling boxes to a storage facility on the south side of town. You store it. A depressing row of corrugated metal doors behind a chain-link fence. It was a fitting place. It was a waiting room for objects that had outlived their owners. I stacked the boxes in the 10 by 10 unit. I placed the photos in the back, facing the wall. I didn't want them watching me leave. When I rolled the metal door down, the latch clicked with a sound of finality. I put a heavy padlock on the hasp. I checked it twice. I drove back to the house. It was dark now. Entering the hallway felt different. The air was thinner. The house looked the same. The sofa was there, the TV, the dining table, but the soul had been scooped out. It was a stage set now. The furniture was just props. The silence was artificial. Good, I whispered. My voice bounced off the bare walls. Now came the engineering. I went to the garage and retrieved my toolbox. I didn't need a hammer or a saw. I needed wire strippers, a soldering iron, and the components I had ordered online under a pseudonym. I started in the kitchen. The smoke detector above the doorway was 10 years old, yellowing plastic. I stood on a step stool, gritting my teeth as reaching up pulled at the bruised muscle in my side.
I twisted the unit off the ceiling. I gutted it. I removed the ionization sensor and replaced it with a wide-angle 4K pinhole camera. It was tiny, the lens no bigger than the period at the end of a sentence. I wired it into the house's hardline power so it wouldn't die. I drilled a microchannel through the drywall into the attic for the Ethernet cable. I didn't trust Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi can be jammed. Copper is faithful. I repeated the process in the hallway and the living room. I placed a motion sensor inside the hollowed-out spine of a hardcover book on the bookshelf, War and Peace, a fitting title. I ran the cables through the attic, crawling over the insulation, sweating in the freezing air. I brought everything down to the utility closet in the basement. This was the nerve center. I set up a dedicated server, a black box the size of a toaster. I connected it to the fiber optic line. I wasn't recording to a hard drive. If they burned the house down, a hard drive would melt. I was recording to the cloud. I sat on the concrete floor, the laptop glowing blue on my knees. I configured the upload path. Destination, secure S3 bucket. Access protocol, read only. Link generated. I routed the alert system. The moment the motion sensors were tripped between the hours of 12 a.m. and 6 a.m., the system would begin a mirrored upload. And the recipient. I didn't send it to the local police. Captain Miller would just delete the email. I didn't send it to the papers. They needed time to verify. I set up a scheduled script. The moment the event was confirmed, the system would package the video stream and email the access credentials to the intake server of the State Attorney General's Public Corruption Unit. I had found the address on a government transparency site. It was a direct line to the people who ate mayors for breakfast. I typed in the command lines. If motion detect equals true, initiate stream. If stream duration greater than 30 seconds, send alert, AG office. I pressed enter. The cursor blinked, then steadied. System armed. I stood up, wiping the dust from my knees. The basement hummed with the quiet electricity of the server. I went back upstairs. The house was a mousetrap now, a glass box wired with 50,000 volts of transparency. I walked through the rooms one last time. I checked the angles. The kitchen camera covered the back door. The hallway camera covered the approach to the stairs. The living room camera covered the center of the floor. There were blind spots, of course. There always are. But I wasn't trying to film a movie. I was trying to catch a rat. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of tap water. I sat at the empty table. The clock on the wall ticked. Talk, talk, talk. It was the only sound left. I had removed everything I loved. I had removed the soft edges. All that was left was the structure, the surveillance, and the old man sitting in the dark, waiting for the monsters to come out from under the bed. I was ready. The stage was set. Now, I just needed to send the invitation. The toy store was an assault on the senses. It smelled of plasticizers, synthetic vanilla, and the frenetic energy of children who hadn't yet learned that the world is a disappointment. The lighting was aggressive, halogen strips that made the primary colors vibrate. I walked down the plush aisle. I was an anomaly here, a gray coat in a sea of neon. Mothers clutched their toddlers a little tighter when I passed. I didn't blame them. I wasn't radiating the warmth of a grandfather looking for a birthday gift. I was radiating the cold precision of a man selecting a munition. I found it on the bottom shelf. It was a brown bear, 18 inches tall, with a red corduroy bow tie. The bear. I had seen it in the surveillance photos of the grandson, Leo, clutched in his hand as he walked to the car. It was his totem, his security object. I picked it up. The fur was soft, cheap polyester. It had beady plastic eyes that stared at nothing. I squeezed it. It was soft, yielding. "Just that?" the cashier asked. She was chewing gum, popping bubbles that sounded like small caliber fire. "Yes," I said. "No bag." I walked out into the cold. The bear sat on the passenger seat of my truck, a silent passenger. It looked innocent, but in the context of what I was about to do, it was more dangerous than a pipe bomb. A bomb destroys matter. This would destroy their sanity. I drove to the self-service kiosk at the postal center 3 towns over. I wore latex gloves, not to hide prints, but to prevent my DNA from contaminating the message. I had the box ready, a plain cardboard cube. I placed the bear inside. He looked up at me from the bottom of the box. Then I added the anchor. It was a glossy 8x10 photograph I had printed at a pharmacy kiosk.
It wasn't a picture of the boy. It wasn't a threatening note made of magazine letters. It was a high-resolution shot of the intersection at 4th and Oak. The angle was low. It showed the crosswalk. It showed the specific patch of asphalt where the rain never quite washed away the stain. I placed the photo on top of the bear. The bear's face was covered by the scene of the crime. I sealed the box with clear packing tape, Z-rip, smooth, airtight. I affixed the label, personal and confidential, Robert Calloway. I used his home address, the one he thought was off the grid. I dropped the package into the metal chute. The clunk of it hitting the bottom of the bin was heavy, final. The trigger had been pulled. The bullet was in the mail. I didn't go back to the house. The house was now a hot zone. It was a pressure vessel waiting to rupture.
I drove 3 miles east to the industrial park that overlooked the valley. It was a graveyard of rusting machinery and warehouses that had closed in the 90s. I parked the truck behind a defunct textile factory. The location gave me a view of the city lights, a sprawling grid of amber and white, but kept me deep in the shadows. I killed the engine. The silence rushed in to fill the cab, cold and absolute. I pulled my tablet from the glove box. I mounted it on the dashboard holder I used for GPS. I tapped the screen. The feed loaded. 4 quadrants of grayscale night vision. Camera 1. Kitchen. The table was empty. The shadows of the tree branches outside moved across the floor like skeletal fingers. Camera 2. Hallway. Long, narrow, terminating in the front door, the focal point of the ambush. Camera 3. Living room. The sofa sat there, a dark shape. The empty shelves looked like ribs. Camera 4. Basement. The server lights blinked, a steady heartbeat in the dark. Green, green, green. I poured coffee from my thermos. It was black, bitter, and lukewarm. I held the cup with both hands to steal the last of the heat. Now, I waited. The toy store was an assault on the senses. It smelled of plasticizers, synthetic vanilla, and the frenetic energy of children who hadn't yet learned that the world is a disappointment. The lighting was aggressive, halogen strips that made the primary colors vibrate. I walked down the plush aisle. I was an anomaly here, a gray coat in a sea of neon. Mothers clutched their toddlers a little tighter when I passed. I didn't blame them. I wasn't radiating the warmth of a grandfather looking for a birthday gift. I was radiating the cold precision of a man selecting a munition. I found it on the bottom shelf. It was a brown bear, 18 inches tall, with a red corduroy bow tie. The bear, I had seen it in the surveillance photos of the grandson, Leo, clutched in his hand as he walked to the car. It was his totem, his security object. I picked it up. The fur was soft, cheap polyester. It had beady plastic eyes that stared at nothing. I squeezed it. It was soft, yielding. "Just that?" the cashier asked. She was chewing gum, popping bubbles that sounded like small caliber fire. "Yes," I said. "No bag." I took a sip of coffee. I watched the time tick over. 9 p.m. 10 p.m. The frost began to form on the truck's windshield, a delicate, crystalline waste. I didn't turn the heater on. I needed to stay cold. I needed to stay sharp. I watched the screen until my eyes burned. I was the ghost in the machine, the operator of a system designed to destroy the men who thought they were untouchable. I wasn't Elias Thorne, the retired engineer, anymore. I was the consequences, and consequences were coming up the driveway. 2 a.m. is the hour of lowest physiological resistance. The body temperature drops, the mind fogs, and the will to fight is at its nadir. It is the perfect time for a structure to fail, or for an assassination. I sat in the cab of the truck, the heater off to save fuel and keep the windows from fogging. My breath hung in the air, a phantom cloud that vanished as quickly as it formed. The tablet was mounted on the dash, the brightness turned down to the minimum setting. It cast a sickly, spectral blue light across my hands. The screen flickered. Camera 1. Kitchen. Movement. It didn't start with a knock, it started with a kinetic impact. The back door, the one I had double-locked, shuddered under a massive blow. The wood around the deadbolt splintered. I saw the white flash of fresh timber in the night vision feed. A second kick followed, and the door swung inward, bouncing off the refrigerator. They poured in like black water. 3 of them. They wore dark clothing, heavy boots, and ski masks that turned their heads into featureless stumps.
They moved with a speed that suggested practice. This wasn't a burglary, it was a raid. I put my earbuds in. The audio feed hissed with static, then clarified as the microphone in the smoke detector adjusted to the noise floor. The sound of heavy breathing, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. "Clear left," one whispered. His voice was distorted but distinct. I watched them fan out. Intruder 1 had a baseball bat. He held it choked up near the trademark, ready to swing in tight quarters. Intruder 2 held a crowbar. Intruder 3, the point man, held a pistol. It was a semi-automatic, fitted with a suppressor, a long cylindrical extension that made the barrel look comically long. You don't bring a silenced weapon to an intimidation check, you bring it to an execution. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs, a painful, rhythmic thud. I wasn't afraid for myself. I was 3 miles away, invisible in the dark. I was afraid the technology would fail. I was afraid the stream would lag. Please, I thought, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Be loud, be arrogant. They moved into the living room. Camera 3. The house was dark, but to them it must have felt wrong. It was too empty. There was no clutter, no mail on the table, no shoes by the door. It felt like a trap, and they were beginning to smell it. "Where is he?" Intruder 2 hissed. He took the crowbar and smashed the lamp on the end table. The bulb popped, a sharp crack that spiked on the audio visualizer. "Room is clear." "Check upstairs," the point man said. "He's probably hiding under the bed." I watched them ascend the stairs on camera 2. They moved in a stack, weapon barrels sweeping the empty air. They were hunting a 70-year-old man, and they were doing it with the tactical severity of a SWAT team. I switched the feed to the upstairs landing. They kicked open the door to the master bedroom. I couldn't see inside. I hadn't put a camera in the bedroom itself, a final shred of privacy I couldn't part with. But the microphone in the hallway picked up the sounds of violence. I heard the mattress being flipped. I heard drawers being ripped out and dumped on the floor. I heard the hollow thud of the bat hitting the wall, searching for a false panel. Then, silence. They came back out into the hall. They looked confused. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold realization that the target was missing. "He's not here," Intruder 1 said. He pulled off his mask, revealing a face that was red and sweating. He was young, thick-necked. He looked like he bounced at a club on the weekends. "Place is gutted. Look at this shit. No clothes, no pictures. Keep your mask on, you idiot," the point man snapped. He didn't remove his. He was the professional. He walked to the railing and looked down into the dark foyer. "Calloway said he'd be here," the unmasked one grumbled.
Gotcha. I felt a surge of triumph so potent it almost warmed the cab. He said the name. The audio file was being written to the cloud server instantly. The packets of data were flying through the fiber optic lines, indestructible evidence being forged in real time. "Shut up," the point man hissed. He holstered the pistol and pulled out a phone. He dialed a number. I turned the volume up on my tablet to the maximum. "Yeah, it's clean," the point man said into the phone. "House is empty. Staged. No boy. No old man. Yeah, I know what you said." He listened for a moment. I watched his head tilt. "Boss, if he's not here, we can't do the job." Okay. He hung up. He looked at the other two. "Tear it apart," he commanded. "Find the journal. Find the laptop. If he comes back while we're doing it..." He paused, and for a second he looked directly at the smoke detector. He didn't see the lens. He just looked into the void. "If he comes back, we stick to the plan," the point man said. His voice was flat, devoid of humanity. 2 shots to the chest, 1 to the head. Put the gun in his hand. Make it look like he did it to himself. Make it look like he did it to himself. The words hung in the air, captured, digitized, and uploaded. Solicitation of capital murder, conspiracy, breaking and entering with intent. I watched as they began to destroy my home. Intruder 2 took the crowbar to the drywall, ripping huge chunks of gypsum down, searching for a safe. Intruder 1 took the bat to the banister, smashing the spindles my wife had polished every week for 30 years. It was hard to watch. It was like watching an autopsy on a loved one. They were violating the sanctuary where I had built a life. They were spitting on the memory of the woman I loved. But a house is just wood and glass. Justice is structural. I looked at the server status on the bottom right of the screen. Upload complete. Alerts sent, State AG Corruption Unit. The email was out. The video file, time-stamped and clear as day, was sitting in the inbox of the State Attorney General. It was also in the inbox of the FBI field office, CC'd as a failsafe.
The point man was now in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator and throwing the contents onto the floor. Milk pooled on the linoleum, white blood spreading across the tiles. "Burn it?" Intruder one asked, looking at the mess. "No fire," the point man said. "Too much attention. Just find the book." They wouldn't find the book. The book was ash in a barrel 3 towns over. I had burned the forgery an hour ago. The bait had served its purpose. I reached for the ignition key. My hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. I didn't call 911. The local police would just get in the way. They might even tip off the intruders. No, this needed to be a federal hammer. I started the truck. The engine rumbled to life. On the screen, the point man froze. He tilted his head. He had heard the engine start? No, 3 miles away. He was reacting to something else.
Sirens. Not the wail of a single cruiser. A chorus. A swarm. I looked out the windshield toward the city. Blue and red lights were cresting the hill, silent from this distance, but visually deafening. They were coming from the highway, not the local precinct. State troopers. The trap had snapped shut. I put the truck in gear. I wasn't going down there. I was going to watch the fire from the ridge. "Smile, gentlemen," I whispered to the screen. "You're on candid camera."
The drafts folder on my tablet contained a single email. It had been sitting there for 48 hours, a loaded gun resting on a digital table. 2. Investigations at FBI.gov. Tips at statepolice.state.nj.us. Breaking news at channel4.com. Editors at citychronicle.com. Subject: urgent. Active home invasion, solicitation of murder, Mayor Callaway evidence. Attachments: stream link access.key, audio clip 01.wave. I didn't hesitate. I didn't tremble. I simply tapped the glass. Sending. Sent. The progress bar zipped across the screen and vanished. It was anticlimactic. There was no explosion, no thunderclap, just a silent packet of data dismantling a dynasty. The information was now replicating, bouncing off satellites, landing on servers in Quantico and Trenton. It was out of my hands. It was out of Callaway's hands. On the live feed, the violence continued. Intruder 1, the one with the baseball bat, was currently smashing the drywall in the hallway. He was looking for a wall safe that didn't exist. He was sweating, his movements jerky and frantic. He looked like a man trying to kill a swarm of bees with a sledgehammer. "Nothing here," he shouted. The audio cracked with the force of his frustration. The point man, the professional, was standing in the middle of the living room ruins. He was checking his phone again. He looked uneasy. He sensed the shift in pressure, the way animals sense an earthquake seconds before the ground rolls. I looked out the windshield of my truck. From my vantage point on the ridge, the valley was a bowl of darkness punctuated by the amber grid of streetlights. Then the horizon changed. It started as a flicker on the highway ramp 3 miles west of my house. Blue lights. Not 1 or 2, but a ribbon of them. They moved fast, a synchronized stream of luminescence cutting through the night. State troopers. I had bypassed the local precinct entirely. Captain Miller and his water-stained ceiling were irrelevant now. I had gone straight to the state attorney general's office with the corruption evidence, and the FBI with the kidnapping threat implication. When you ring the bell that loud, the big dogs come running. I looked back at the screen. The point man snapped his head up. He heard it too.
"Abort," he barked. "We're leaving, now." "We haven't found the book," Intruder 2 yelled, ripping a cushion off the sofa. "Forget the book. Move." The point man ran for the back door. He kicked aside a pile of debris, the shattered remains of my toaster, and reached for the handle. He froze. Through the splintered gap in the doorframe, a beam of blinding white light cut into the kitchen. It was intense, tactical, a spotlight mounted on a rifle or a helicopter. "State Police!" The voice was amplified, booming from a loudspeaker that rattled the remaining windows. "Drop the weapons. Exit the structure with your hands in the air." The audio on my tablet peaked, redlining into distortion. The point man scrambled back, slipping on the milk-slicked floor. He raised his suppressed pistol, then lowered it. He was a killer, but he was a calculator too. He knew the math. 3 men with handguns against a perimeter of AR-15s and Kevlar, the equation equaled 0. "Back! Out the front!" he screamed. They stampeded toward the hallway. Camera 2 caught the panic in their eyes. The masks were still on, but the body language was pure terror. They hit the front door. Intruder 1 yanked it open.
Flashbangs are designed to disorient. On a camera feed, they just look like a sudden washing out of the image, followed by a momentary gray static. Whoomp. The feed glitched. When the image resolved a second later, the hallway was filled with thick white smoke. Figures in tactical gear, heavy armor, helmets, shields, swarmed through the smoke like gray ghosts. I watched Intruder 1 go down hard. A shield hit him in the chest and he folded. Intruder 2 tried to raise the crowbar and was tackled into the drywall, his head going through the plaster I had hung 20 years ago. The point man didn't fight. He dropped to his knees in the center of the living room. He placed the silenced pistol on the floor and interlaced his fingers behind his head. He looked straight into the camera lens hidden in the bookshelf. He knew. In that moment, he knew he had been performing for an audience. I picked up my thermos and unscrewed the cap. The coffee was stone cold, but I drank it anyway. It washed the taste of bile out of my throat. I looked out the window again. My street was a carnival of lights. The quiet cul-de-sac was jammed with cruisers, SUVs, and an ambulance that wouldn't be needed. Neighbors were coming out onto their porches, wrapped in bathrobes, witnessing the end of the world as they knew it. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again. Unknown number. Probably the FBI agent assigned to the inbox I had just flooded. I let it ring. I needed a moment. The narrative was set. The mayor's phone records would show the call to the point man at 2:05 a.m. The audio from the house captured the point man confirming the order, make it look self-inflicted. Calloway could argue he didn't order the hit. He could argue the men were rogue, but the money trail would be there. The previous cover-up of the hit and run would be reopened. And the journal? The journal didn't exist. If the intruders claimed they were there to retrieve a threatening manifesto, the police would ask, where is it? It wasn't in the house. It wasn't in the trash. It was ash.
Without the physical book, their defense crumbled into hearsay. They were just armed men breaking into an elderly widower's home with a silencer and a suicide plan. The eye for an eye threat would be dismissed as the desperate lie of caught hitmen trying to blame the victim. Even if they found the digital traces of the forgery, the handwriting practice sheets I had burned, or the receipts, it wouldn't matter. You don't break into a house with a hit squad to retrieve a diary. You call the police. By bypassing the law, Calloway had proved his guilt. I watched the police drag the point man out the front door. They had stripped off his mask. He looked ordinary. Just a man with a buzz cut and a jagged scar on his chin. He wasn't a monster. He was just a tool. A hammer that had been swung by a soft hand. My house was destroyed. I could see the wreckage through the open door. The furniture was kindling. The walls were scarred. The china was dust. It didn't matter. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. It was a weapon I had fired once, and now I could discard the casing. The phone buzzed a third time. I picked it up.
Thorne, I said. My voice was steady. Mr. Thorne, this is Special Agent Holloway, FBI. We received your email. Are you safe? I am, I said. I'm watching from a safe distance. Stay where you are, the agent said, his voice clipped and professional. We have units securing your residence. We have the suspects in custody. We need you to come in for a statement. I'll be there, I said. Mr. Thorne, the agent hesitated. The email, it mentions Mayor Calloway. The audio file is clear, Agent, I said. Listen to the recording at timestamp 0204. He confirms the order. There was a silence on the other end, the sound of a man realizing the size of the pile of paperwork that just landed on his desk. We'll need to verify the voice signature, the agent said, but the skepticism was gone. He sounded hungry. If this checks out, this is big. It checks out, I said. He hired them to kill me because I wouldn't let him forget he killed my wife. Okay, stay put. A unit is coming to your location to escort you.
I hung up. I looked at the house one last time. The flashing blue lights reflected off the snow, turning the front yard into a strobe-lit dance floor. I had lost Eleanor. I had lost the house. I had lost the quiet dignity of my retirement. But as I watched the state troopers loading the men into the back of the vans, I felt a sensation I hadn't felt in 6 months. The pressure in my chest, the constant crushing weight of gravity, had lifted. The load had been transferred. The structure of their lies had collapsed. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes for a second. Clean streets, Elle, I whispered. Clean streets. The sound of tires crunching on gravel behind me made me open my eyes. A black SUV with government plates was pulling up the hill. The headlights swept across my cabin, blinding me for a moment. I raised my hands, palms open. I wasn't fighting anymore. The war was over. I was just the man left standing in the rubble. The yellow police tape was the only thing moving. It was stretched across the front pillars, a garish synthetic sash that snapped in the wind like a whip. Thwack, thwack, thwack. I ducked under it. It felt substantial, a plastic barrier meant to keep the curious out. But I wasn't curious. I was the owner. It had been 7 days. The forensic teams had cleared out 48 hours ago, leaving behind boot prints in the snow and little dusting of black powder on the doorframe. The front window, shattered by a flashbang, was covered with a sheet of OSB plywood. The back door, where the cleaners had made their breach, was boarded up with heavier timber. It looked like a scar tissue, rough and ugly, but functional. I walked up the steps. My ribs still ached, a dull, rusted throb that reminded me of the cost of doing business, but I stood straight. I didn't go inside. There was nothing inside for me yet. The interior was a wreck of smashed drywall and splintered furniture, a chaotic mess that I would eventually have to itemize for an insurance adjuster who would look at me with pity. I wasn't ready for the pity. I sat on the top step of the porch, the concrete cold through my trousers. I unscrewed the cap of my thermos. The steam rose in a thin white column, vanishing instantly into the gray afternoon. I poured a cup. Black, no sugar. I took a sip. It was bitter, scalding, and absolutely clean. It tasted like truth. I looked out at the street. It was quiet. The neighbors were inside, probably peering through their curtains, whispering about the old man and the commando raid. Let them whisper. They were safe now. They just didn't know who to thank. Robert Calloway was out on bail, $2 million, posted by a shell company that was currently being dissected by forensic accountants from the FBI. He was back in his mansion, but it wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a prison. The news cycle had been relentless. Mayor linked to contract killers. Corruption probe reopens cold case. The headlines were sledgehammers swinging at the pillars of his legacy. He had resigned yesterday, citing health reasons, the universal code for a rat fleeing a sinking ship. Julian was nowhere to be found. Rumor had it he was in a rehab facility in Arizona, hidden away by lawyers, but the federal subpoena would find him. The hit-and-run investigation was no longer a local matter controlled by a water-stained captain. It was federal. The Midnight Pearl SUV had been located in a scrapyard in Newark, crushed into a cube, but not crushed enough to hide the VIN. I took another sip of coffee. I didn't feel happy. Happiness is a volatile emotion, a chemical spike that fades. This was something denser. This was the satisfaction of a load calculation that balances perfectly to zero. I looked at the intersection down the hill. I couldn't see the stain on the asphalt from here, but I knew it was there.
"I didn't get you back, Elle," I said to the cold air. The wind rustled the dead leaves in the gutters. "I couldn't fix the bridge," I whispered, "so I demolished the obstruction. It was a fair trade, or as close to fair as this crooked world allows." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key to the storage unit. Eleanor's quilt, her photos, the Royal Doulton china. They were safe, waiting in the dark. I would bring them back. I would patch the drywall. I would replace the door. I would sand down the floors where the boots had scuffed them. It would take time. The house would never be what it was. The innocence was gone, stripped away by the violence of the last week. But it would stand. It had good bones. I finished the coffee and screwed the cup back onto the thermos. The metal threads caught with a satisfying click. For the first time in 6 months, the static in my head was gone. The constant grinding noise of injustice, the sound of gears stripping, of bolts shearing, had ceased. There was just the wind, the distant hum of traffic, and the beat of my own heart. I stood up, my knees popping. I brushed the grit off my coat. I looked at the plywood covering the front door. I would need to measure that frame. I would need to buy new lumber. I would need to mix mortar for the brickwork. There was work to be done. I turned the key in the lock. The tumblers fell into place, smooth and heavy. I pushed the door open and stepped into the ruin of my home, ready to start the rebuild.